October 26, 1942. Guadalcanal. The radio crackles once, then falls silent. Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige presses a handset against his ear, listening to static where a voice should be, where orders should be coming through, where someone should be telling him that reinforcements are on the way. Instead, there is nothing but the hiss of dead air and the sound of his own breathing. Behind him, 33 Marines are dug into a ridgeline that overlooks a narrow valley choked with jungle, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion, their eyes tracking movement in the darkness below. In front of him, the jungle is alive with something that shouldn't be there. Branches snapping under the weight of hundreds of men moving with purpose, voices calling out in Japanese. The metallic click of rifle bolts and the soft scrape of bayonets being fixed. The last transmission, before the radio died, was 6 words that turned his stomach to ice. Help is not coming. Hold position. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Mitchell Paige was born in 1918 in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, a coal town where the air tasted like sulfur and men died young from black lung or cave-ins or the slow, grinding poverty that turned bones brittle and hope into a luxury no one could afford. His father worked the mines for 28 years, went underground every morning before the sun came up, came home every night coughing black spit into a rag that his mother boiled and hung to dry and pretended was normal. Mitchell watched his father die when he was 15, watched the man who had carried him on his shoulders and taught him to fish waste away in a hospital bed, drowning in his own lungs, and he made a promise to himself that day that he would never die in the dark, never die slow, never let the world grind him down into nothing. He joined the Marine Corps 3 months after his 18th birthday in 1936, when the world was still pretending that another war wasn't coming, that the treaty signed after the last one will hold, that men had learned their lesson about industrial-scale killing. They sent him to Paris Island, where drill instructors with faces like clenched fists screamed at him until his ears rang, made him run until he vomited, taught him that a Marine's job is simple and absolute. Hold the line, never retreat, die before you give ground. He believed them because he needed to believe in something, needed to feel like his life had a purpose bigger than coal dust and early graves. By 1942, he was a platoon sergeant, lean and hard, with the kind of eyes that didn't blink much and didn't look away when things got ugly. They shipped him to the South Pacific, to Guadalcanal, where the jungle was a living thing that rotted your boots and bred fevers in your blood, where the air was so thick with humidity that breathing felt like drowning, where the Japanese fought with fanaticism that terrified and impressed in equal measure. This was not the war that newspapers described, not the clean strategic war of maps and arrows and communiques about tactical victories. This was mud and malaria, trench foot and dengue fever, men dying from infected cuts as often as they died from bullets. The Japanese had held these islands since the beginning of the war, had dug in deep, had turned every ridge and valley into a fortified nightmare of bunkers and machine gun nests and artillery positions sited with mathematical precision. The American strategy was island hopping, taking one blood-soaked piece of ground at a time, pushing the Japanese back toward their home islands mile by mile, body by body. Cemetery by cemetery, Guadalcanal was the hinge. If the Allies lost here, the road to Tokyo would stretch another 5 years and cost another 100,000 lives. If they held, if they could break the Japanese momentum, the war would shift, the balance would tip, and victory would become possible instead of theoretical. The ridgeline that Paige and his platoon occupied was designated Hill 555 on the tactical maps, a nothing piece of ground that mattered only because it overlooked a valley that the Japanese needed to move troops and supplies. Command had sent them up 4 days earlier with orders that were simple to the point of insult. Dig in, hold the hill, do not let the enemy through. They had done the digging, had carved fighting positions out of the red volcanic soil, had strung fields of fire through the jungle, had positioned their 2 Browning M1917 machine guns to create overlapping kill zones that would turn the approaches into a meat grinder. The men were exhausted, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the deep bone-weary exhaustion that comes from weeks in combat, from watching friends die, from knowing that every sunrise might be your last. They had been promised reinforcements, a fresh company to rotate them off the line, to give them a few days in the rear where they could sleep without their rifles and eat something hot, and maybe write letters home that wouldn't be censored into meaninglessness. But 2 nights ago, the Japanese had launched a coordinated offensive 30 miles south, had broken to the American line in 4 places, had turned a quiet sector into a screaming chaos of artillery and banzai charges. Every available unit had been thrown into the breach, every reserve committed, and suddenly there were no reinforcements to send, no relief column that could reach Hill 555 before the Japanese decided to take it. The radio message had come at 2,130 hours, delivered by a lieutenant whose voice sounded like a man reading his own death warrant. The Japanese were massing the valley below, at least 2 companies and possibly more, preparing for a night assault that would hit within hours. The Americans on Hill 555 were on their own. They could retreat, abandon the position, and fall back to the secondary line, or they could stay with what they had and hold against odds that made survival unlikely and victory nearly impossible. The lieutenant didn't give an order. He presented the options and waited, because some decisions are too heavy for rank alone to carry. Paige had looked at his men, had seen the fear in their faces and the determination underneath it, and he had understood that retreat was not really an option. Not for Marines, not for men who had been taught that giving ground was worse than dying. He had made a decision without drama, without speeches, just a flat statement that they would stay, that they would hold, that they would make the Japanese pay for every inch of ground in blood and bodies. The men had nodded, had checked their weapons, had written letters they hoped wouldn't need to be mailed, and they had waited for the darkness to bring what it would bring. Paige spent the last hours of daylight walking the line, checking positions, redistributing ammunition, making sure every man understood his field of fire and his fallback point. The 2 machine guns were the key to everything. Browning M1917S, water-cooled, belt-fed, capable of firing 700 rounds per minute when they were running smooth and the gunners kept their nerve. He knew these weapons intimately, knew how they heated up after sustained fire, how the barrel would glow red if you pushed them hard, how the water in the cooling jacket would boil and turn to steam and sometimes crack the metal if you weren't careful. He positioned the first gun on the left flank, covering the main approach from the valley, a natural avenue of attack where the jungle thinned and the slope was gentle enough for men to advance without climbing. The second gun went 30 yards to the right, covering a secondary trail that wound up through denser vegetation. Between them, the 2 guns could create a crossfire that would overlap in the center, turning the killing ground into a place where nothing could live for more than a few seconds. But it only worked if the gunners held their positions, if they didn't panic when the enemy came in waves, if they could maintain fire discipline and keep the weapons running when every instinct was screaming at them to run. The ammunition count was the thing that kept Paige awake at night. They had roughly 4,000 rounds for the 2 machine guns combined, maybe 40 rounds per man for their M1 Garens, a dozen grenades scattered among the platoon. It sounded like a lot until you did the math, until you calculated how fast ammunition disappears in combat, how a machine gun can burn through 200 rounds in less than 30 seconds, how quickly you go from confident to desperate to empty. If the Japanese came in multiple waves, if they were willing to take casualties and keep pushing, the Americans would run dry before dawn. And once the ammunition was gone, it came down to bayonets and rifle butts and whatever happens when men fight hand-to-hand in the dark. Paige didn't share these calculations with his men. They knew. Every combat veteran knows the arithmetic of survival, knows that firepower and ammunition are the only things standing between order and chaos, that running out of bullets is a nightmare that wakes you up gasping in the night. He just walked the line and checked the belts and made sure the gunners knew to fire in short control bursts, to let the barrels cool between engagements, to make every round count because there would be no resupply, no ammunition drop, no miraculous delivery of more bullets. The first sounds came at 0245 hours. Not gunfire, but movement. The soft rustle of many men moving through jungle, trying to be quiet and failing, because there's no way to move 100 men through dense vegetation without making noise. Paige was instantly awake, had never really been asleep, just hovering in that state of exhausted alertness that combat soldiers learn to inhabit. He moved to the left machine gun position, crouched beside the gunner, a corporal from Nebraska named Hayes, who was 19 years old and looked like he should be in high school, not in a fighting hole, on a jungle ridge waiting to kill or be killed. Hayes had steady hands and good instincts, didn't waste ammunition, didn't freeze under fire. Paige put a hand on his shoulder, felt the tension in the kid's muscles, the fear and readiness mixed together. He whispered instructions that were more about psychology than tactics, reminding Hayes to wait for the command, to fire in bursts, to trust his training, to remember that the gun was his responsibility and his power. The movement in the jungle grew louder, closer, and then the jungle itself seemed to shift, shadows detaching from darkness, taking shape, becoming men. The attack began without warning, without the preliminary artillery barrage that doctrine called for, without the probing assault that was supposed to test the defenses. One moment the jungle was full of watching shadows, and the next it exploded with muzzle flashes and a high-pitched scream of Japanese soldiers charging uphill. They came in a wave, rifles firing from the hip, bayonets catching moonlight, voices raised in a battle cry that was designed to terrorize and often succeeded. Paige didn't need to give the order. Both machine guns opened up simultaneously. The Brownings roar into life with sound like fabric tearing at high speed. Long ripping bursts that cut across the hillside and threw up geysers of dirt and shredded vegetation. The first rank of Japanese soldiers went down like grass before a scythe, bodies tumbling and spinning. The momentum of their charge broken in the first heartbeat of contact. But there were more behind them, always more, and they kept coming, stepping over their dead, firing as they ran, some of them making it within 15 yards of Marine positions before rifle fire from the foxholes cut them down. Paige was firing his M1 Garand, 8-round clips, the distinctive ping of the empty clip, ejecting, aiming low, because men running uphill present a rising target, squeezing off shots with the mechanical precision of someone who has done this enough times that thought and action have merged into reflex. The machine gun beside him was working like a metronome, Hayes firing in controlled bursts, adjusting left and right, walking the fire across the assault line. The barrel already starting to glow faint orange in the darkness. Japanese soldiers were falling in clusters, the ones in front tripping the ones behind, the wave losing coherence, becoming individual men, making individual decisions about whether to keep charging or go to ground or turn and run. Most of them kept coming, because their training and their culture demanded it, because retreat was more shameful than death, because they believed in what they were doing with the kind of certainty that makes men willing to die. The wave broke after maybe 90 seconds, the survivors melting back into the jungle, leaving behind a slope littered with bodies, and the screams of wounded men calling for medics in a language the Americans didn't understand and wouldn't have helped with even if they did. Paige used a brief silence to check his line, moving from position to position in a crouch, calling out to his men, making sure everyone was still functional, redistributing ammunition from the dead to the living. One Marine was down, killed in the first seconds by a bullet through the throat. 2 others were wounded, one with a round to the shoulder that had shattered bone, another with shrapnel from a grenade that had landed close, but not close enough. The wounded were dragged to a deeper foxhole that served as a casualty collection point, and the line contracted slightly, tightening around the machine guns. Paige knew what was coming next because he had fought the Japanese before, had learned their patterns and their doctrine, and their refusal to accept tactical failure. They didn't do single assaults. They probed, they tested, they identified weak points, and then they came again, harder, concentrating force where the defense was thinnest. He moved to the right machine gun, checked the ammunition belt, saw that they had burned through maybe 300 rounds in the first engagement. At that rate, they would be empty before dawn, and dawn was still 5 hours away. The math was simple and brutal. They couldn't sustain this rate of fire. They had to be more selective, had to let some targets go, had to accept that perfect defense was impossible and good enough defense was the only option. He gave the orders, told the gunners to fire shorter bursts, to prioritize targets that were closest or most dangerous, to let the riflemen handle the stragglers. The men nodded, understanding the calculus, understanding that they were trading perfect lethality for the chance to keep fighting longer. The second wave hit 18 minutes later, and this time the Japanese had adjusted their tactics. They came from 2 directions simultaneously, splitting their force, trying to divide the American fire and overwhelm one flank before defenders could shift. Paige saw it immediately, recognized the tactic from training manuals in previous battles, and made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if it failed. He pulled the crew from the right machine gun, ordered them to abandon position, and reinforced the left gun, consolidating all their automatic weapons fire on a single axis. It was a calculated gamble. If the Japanese realized the right flank was now defended only by riflemen, they could exploit the gap to get behind the American line and roll up the entire position from the rear. But Paige had watched the first assault, had seen how they moved, had understood something fundamental about this particular enemy unit. They were brave, but not flexible. They were committed to the frontal assault, to the philosophy of overwhelming the enemy through courage and mass. They would keep hitting the strongest point because that's what their doctrine demanded, what their honor required. He was betting his life and the lives of his men on that assessment. And if he was wrong, they would all be dead before sunrise. He was right. The second wave concentrated on the left approach, a dense mass of humanity surging uphill, and a consolidated machine gun fire tore them apart. Hayes was no longer firing controlled bursts. He was holding the trigger down for longer intervals, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, the gun bucking and roaring, spent casings piling up beside the position, steam rising from the water jacket as the coolant boiled. The barrel was glowing now, not just orange but moving toward red, the metal stressed beyond its design limits. Paige was beside him, feeding ammunition belts, clearing a jam when a spent cartridge failed to eject properly, shouting encouragement over the noise, his voice hoarse from smoke and adrenaline. The Japanese were dying in heaps, the bodies piling up in drifts, but they kept coming, kept charging into fire that should have broken any sane unit's morale. Some of them made it within 10 yards of Marine positions, close enough that Paige could see their faces, young faces, determined faces, faces twisted with fear and courage and the kind of desperate commitment that comes from knowing you're probably to die, but charging anyway. The wave broke, and this time the Japanese didn't retreat all the way. They went to ground 20 yards out, using the bodies of their dead as cover, firing from prone positions, trying to suppress the American line, and set up for the next assault. It was smart tactics, and it pinned the Marines, made movement dangerous, turned the hilltop into a space where lifting your head above the foxhole rim invited a bullet. Paige crawled along the line, ignoring the round snapping overhead, the supersonic crack of bullets passing close enough to feel the pressure wave, checking each position, whispering to his men, keeping them focused and functional. The ammunition situation was becoming critical. The machine gun was down to maybe 600 rounds. The riflemen were averaging 15 to 20 rounds each, and the Japanese showed no signs of giving up. He made another decision, one that felt insane even as he was making it. He ordered half the Marines to cease fire, to conserve ammunition, to hold their shots until the next assault. The Japanese would interpret the slackening fire as weakness, as the Americans running low or losing their nerve. They would come again, confident and committed, and when they did, the Marines would hit them with everything remaining one massive coordinated volley, and after that it would be whatever it would be. The third wave came at 0420 hours, less than 2 hours before dawn. This time there was no subtlety, no tactical nuance, just massive momentum and the willingness to die. They came out of the jungle in a solid line, shoulder to shoulder, rifles raised, screaming, and for the first time that night Paige felt real fear, not the manageable fear that sharpens your senses, but the kind that makes your hands shake and your vision narrow and your brain scream at you to run. There were too many, even with perfect fire discipline. Even with every shot a kill, there were simply too many bodies, too much momentum, too much weight. The machine gun opened up, and Hayes was no longer trying to conserve ammunition, no longer firing bursts, just holding the trigger down and letting the Browning roar. The barrel now white-hot, the water in the jacket boiling away, steam pouring out the overflow valve. The Japanese kept coming. 15 yards, 10 yards, close enough that Paige could hear them breathing, could smell the sweat and gun oil and the copper stink of blood. The riflemen were firing as fast as they could work the bolts, no longer aiming carefully, just pointing and shooting. Try to create enough volume of fire to slow the charge, to buy another second, another breath. The machine gun jammed. Paige heard Hayes scream in frustration, heard the gun go silent at the worst possible moment, saw the corporal frantically working the action, trying to clear a failure that might have been a bad round or an overheated chamber or metal fatigue from sustained firing. There was no time to diagnose, no time to fix it properly. The Japanese were at the edge of the position, bayonets raised, close enough that Paige could see the individual expressions on their faces, the fear and determination and the acceptance of death. He made a decision that was pure instinct, no thought involved, just action. He grabbed the machine gun by the barrel, ignoring the immediate searing pain as his palms blistered and stuck to the white-hot metal, and lifted the entire weapon out of its tripod mount. 50 pounds of steel and wood and scalding metal, and he swung it like a club. The first Japanese soldier went down with crushed skull, the heavy receiver impacting with enough force to cave in bone. The second soldier caught the barrel across the face, the red-hot metal burning through flesh, and fell back screaming. Paige kept swinging, using the machine gun as a medieval weapon, his hands smoking, skin peeling, operating on nothing but adrenaline and the refusal to die. Around him, the Marines were fighting hand-to-hand, rifles used as clubs, bayonets and knives and fists, everything civilized stripped away, nothing left but the animal imperative to survive. A Japanese soldier lunged at Paige with a bayonet, and he deflected the thrust with a machine gun body, then reversed the swing and caught the man in the ribs, feeling bones break under the impact. Another soldier came from the side, and Paige dropped low, swept the man's legs out with a gun barrel, then brought the weapon down on his head while he was falling. His hands were on fire, the nerve-ending screaming, but he couldn't let go, couldn't stop moving, because stopping meant dying. He swung the gun again and again, each impact jarring his arms to the shoulder, each kill buying another second of survival. The Japanese soldier in front of him hesitated, just for a heartbeat, seeing this American covered in blood and wielding a weapon that shouldn't be possible to lift, and in that hesitation Paige struck, and the soldier went down. And then, impossibly, the Japanese pulled back. Not a rout, not a panic retreat, but a deliberate withdrawal, the surviving attackers melting back in the jungle as quickly as they had come. Paige stood in the center of the position, chest heaving, still holding the machine gun even though his hands had fused to the metal, even though he could smell his own flesh burning. Around him, the Marines were gasping and bleeding and trying to process what had just happened. He let the gun fall, the metal tearing away from his palms, leaving strips of skin behind. The pain hit him then, not gradual, but all at once, a wave of agony that made his vision white out. He sank to his knees, cradling his ruined hands, and someone was shouting for a medic, but the medic was dead or dying, and there was no morphine left anyway. Paige forced himself to look around, to count his men. 14 still standing. 14 out of 33. The machine gun was destroyed, the barrel warped from heat stress. The receiver cracked. They had maybe 30 rounds of rifle ammunition left in total, scattered across the survivors. Dawn was 40 minutes away, and he could hear movement in the jungle below, the Japanese regrouping, reorganizing for what would certainly be the final assault. It was over. They had done everything humanly possible, had held longer than anyone had a right to expect. But mathematics don't lie, and neither does an ammunition count zero. The next wave would overrun them, and that would be the end. Paige sat with his back against a sandbag, his hands held out in front of him, because touching anything was agony, and watched the sky begin to lighten in the east. He didn't pray. He had stopped believing in prayers somewhere between Pennsylvania and Guadalcanal. He just sat and breathed and waited for whatever came next. The attack didn't come. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 20, and still the Japanese stayed in the jungle. Paige didn't understand until he heard the sound. Faint at first but growing louder, the unmistakable growl of diesel engines and the clank of tracks on rough ground. Armor, reinforcements, a relief column that wasn't supposed to exist, that had been scraped together from rear echelon troops and headquarters personnel, and anyone who could hold a rifle, had fought through the night to reach Hill 555. They came up the trail in the growing light, Sherman tanks in the lead followed by trucks full of infantry, and when the Japanese saw them, when they realized the hill was no longer isolated, they withdrew, fading back into the jungle way they always did when a tactical situation turned against them. The battle for Hill 555 was over. The Americans had held. The mathematics of survival had somehow worked out in their favor, though the cost was counted in bodies and trauma, and wounds that would never fully heal. The medics came with the relief column, and they took one look at Paige's hands and shook their heads. 3rd-degree burns across both palms, the skin char-black in places, already starting to smell like infection. They wrapped him in gauze soaked in something that was supposed to prevent gangrene, gave him a shot of morphine that barely touched the pain, and told him he was in a field hospital and then probably back to the rear for months of treatment. He refused. He stayed on the hill for another 3 days, directing the cleanup, identifying the dead, writing letters to families that would never capture what their sons and husbands had gone through in those dark hours. The body count told part of the story. 19 Marines dead, another 8 wounded badly enough to be evacuated. The Japanese left behind 112 bodies on a hillside, and intelligence estimated at least another 60 wounded carried away during the withdrawals. The ratio was brutal. 6 enemy dead for every American casualty. But ratios don't capture the reality of combat, don't explain the terror or the exhaustion, or the way time stretches and compresses during a firefight. Don't describe the sound of a machine gun firing continuously until the barrel glows, or the smell of burned flesh, or the moment when you realize you're probably to die and you make peace with it. Mitchell Paige was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The citation described his actions in the formal language of military bureaucracy. Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It mentioned the machine gun used as a melee weapon, the leadership under fire, the refusal to yield ground. It didn't mention the nightmares that would wake him up for the next 30 years. Didn't mention the way his hands never quite healed right, the scar tissue that made gripping things difficult, the chronic pain that came with weather changes. The medal ceremony happened 8 months later, in a rear area in Australia, with photographers and generals and speeches about heroism and sacrifice. Paige stood at attention in a dress uniform that felt foreign after months in combat fatigues, accepted the medal with hands that barely worked, and said the things that were expected of him, thanking his men and deflecting praise, and insisting that the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. He didn't believe it, not entirely, but he understood that this was the ritual, that the living are honored so the dead can be remembered, that medals serve a purpose beyond the individual, that a country at war needs symbols of courage and determination. He served through the rest of the war, survived Peleliu and Okinawa, came home in 1945 to a nation that wanted to move on, that wanted its veterans to take off their uniforms and become normal again, as if normal was a state you could return to after you'd spent years learning to kill efficiently. He tried. He married, raised children, worked in various jobs that never quite fit, lived a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow in ways he couldn't articulate. The war followed him, the way it follows all combat veterans, surfacing in unexpected moments, in the backfire of a car that sounded like gunfire, in the smell of diesel exhaust that brings back memories of tanks, in crowds that feel like ambushes waiting to happen. The tactical lessons from Hill 555 were studied at military academies for decades. The importance of interlocking fields of fire, the psychological impact of sustained automatic weapons fire, the value of prepared defensive positions, the critical nature of ammunition management. All true, all useful, all missing the essential point. The real lesson, the one that can't be taught in a classroom or captured in a manual, is that battles are won by individuals who refuse to accept the logic of defeat, who look at impossible odds and decide to make the enemy prove it, who understand that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Mitchell Paige was not superhuman. He was a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania who had watched his father die slow and decided that if death came for him, it would have to take him fighting. The Japanese tested that conviction on a jungle ridge in 1942, and they paid for it with 112 lives. The story faded from public memory, the way most war stories do, overwhelmed by bigger battles and more famous names and the simple passage of time. Hill 555 became a footnote, a minor action in a secondary theater, significant to men who were there and invisible to everyone else. The hill itself still exists, overgrown with jungle now. The foxholes eroded, the evidence of battle swallowed by vegetation. There's no monument, no marker, nothing to indicate that this piece of ground was once worth 131 lives. But the men who survived carried the memory, passed it down to sons and grandsons, told it at reunions that grew smaller every year, kept it alive in a way that veterans keep their wars alive, through stories and silences and the bonds that form between people who have faced death together. They always end the story the same way. with a line that became a kind of prayer among the survivors. They told him help wasn't coming. He stayed anyway. That's what a Marine does. Mitchell Paige lived until 2003, died at 85, and was buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. The Medal of Honor went with him, pinned inside the casket where no one would see it, because he had told his family he didn't want it displayed, didn't want people to think he was special, didn't want the attention. His obituary mentioned the medal, mentioned Guadalcanal, mentioned his post-war career. It didn't mention the machine gun, or the burned hands, or the nights he woke up swinging its shadows. Those details existed in the citation, in the after-action reports, in the memories of the men who served with him, but they weren't the kind of thing that made it into obituaries. History remembers the headlines, not the details, and the details are where the truth lives. The legacy of Hill 555 is not the ground itself, or the tactical lessons extracted from the battle. It's the example of what humans are capable of when pushed to the absolute limit, when survival depends on will rather than resources, when the only thing standing between defeat and victory is a refusal to quit. Paige held that hill with 14 men and killed 55 confirmed enemy soldiers in close combat, using firearms and a machine gun as a club and his own body as a weapon. 55 men who believed in their cause, who were trained and equipped and committed, who charged into fire because their culture and their commanders demanded it, who met a man who had decided a long time ago that he would not go quietly, that death would have to come and take him by force. They tried, and they failed, and the hill stayed in American hands. The mathematics of courage don't add up on paper. You can't calculate the point at which a man breaks, can't predict who will stand and who will run, can't quantify the difference between ordinary and extraordinary. Mitchell Paige was both and neither. A regular man who did irregular things because the situation demanded it, and he refused to accept any other option. The coal miner's son who didn't want to die in the dark found himself on a jungle hill in the dark, and when death came for him in the form of enemy soldiers and impossible odds, he looked in the face and fought back with everything he had, including a weapon that shouldn't have been possible to wield. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what happened on Hill 555. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him.